A quiet veteran's kindness sparks a storm of betrayal and redemption in a small town. Will his honor prevail? Stay to find out. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, stories that give you chills. It was a crisp autumn morning in the sleepy town of Redstone, Arizona, where the sun crept over the horizon, painting the cracked sidewalks in hues of gold. A man, 75 years old, with short grey hair and a lean frame, moved with the deliberate pace of someone who'd learned haste rarely fixed anything. His name didn't matter to the townsfolk. Not yet. He wore a faded brown jacket, pressed khaki pants, and a simple blue button-up shirt, all immaculately clean despite their age. His shoes, polished but worn, clicked softly against the pavement as he walked toward the town's only diner, a place where the smell of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon clung to the air. His face, etched with lines like a map of hard years, carried a quiet dignity. His eyes, though tired, held a flicker of something unbroken, a stubborn spark of kindness that refused to dim. Redstone was small, the kind of place where everyone knew your business, but rarely your heart. For 40 years, he'd lived here, in a modest clapboard house at the edge of town, tending a garden of tomatoes and sunflowers, fixing neighbors' fences without being asked, and never speaking of the past. The townsfolk called him the Old Vet, a nod to the military bearing in his straight posture, though no one knew his story. He didn't offer it, and they didn't ask. His mornings followed a rhythm. Rise at dawn, brew black coffee, walk to the diner for a single cup he'd nurse for an hour while reading a dog-eared book. Today, though, his routine felt heavier, weighted by a memory he couldn't shake. A promise made decades ago to men who never came home. Veterans Day was tomorrow, and the thought of it stirred something restless in him, a longing to honor those he'd lost without drawing attention to himself. He pushed open the diner's glass door, the bell jingling faintly. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a tired smile, nodded. "Good morning, hun," she said, pouring his coffee before he even sat. He gave a small nod, settling into his usual booth by the window, where he could watch the town wake up. His hands, rough from years of labor, wrapped around the warm mug, the faint scent of ceramic and coffee grounding him. But his gaze drifted inward, to a time when his hands held not mugs, but rifles, when his steps weren't measured, but urgent, racing through jungles where every shadow hid a threat. He blinked, pushing the memory down, and opened his book, a worn copy of Hemingway, pages soft as cloth. The diner hummed with the usual crowd, truckers, retirees, a few kids skipping school. No one paid him much mind, and that suited him fine. He'd learned long ago that recognition often came at a cost, and he'd paid enough. The door jingled again, and a woman entered, frail and white-haired, maybe 80 years old. She wore a threadbare grey coat and a faded green scarf, her hands clutching a tattered envelope as if it were her lifeline. Her steps were hesitant, her eyes darting like a deer caught in headlights. The diner fell quiet for a moment, heads turning to size her up. Redstone didn't get many strangers, and she looked out of place, like a ghost from another time. She hovered near the counter, unsure, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the envelope. The waitress raised an eyebrow but said nothing, wiping the counter with a rag. The old man in the booth noticed her discomfort, his book lowering slightly. Something about her, the way she stood, fragile yet defiant, reminded him of soldiers he'd known, men and women who'd faced fear but kept moving forward. He watched as she approached the counter, her voice barely audible. "Excuse me, is there a bus to Fort Walker today?" The waitress shrugged, barely glancing up. "Not till tomorrow, ma'am. You got family there?" The woman's face fell, her shoulders sagging. "No, just something I need to do." Her words were soft, but they carried a weight the old man recognized, a duty unspoken, a debt unpaid. He closed his book, stood, and walked to the counter, his movements unhurried but purposeful. "Coffee's on me," he said quietly, sliding a few crumpled bills across the counter. The waitress blinked, surprised, but took the money. The old woman turned, her eyes meeting his. Up close, her face was a tapestry of wrinkles, her eyes a pale blue that held both gratitude and wariness. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice quivering. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Didn't have to, wanted to." It was a small gesture, nothing to write home about, but to her it seemed to mean more than it should. She nodded, clutching her coffee cup like a shield, and shuffled to a booth across from his. The diner resumed its chatter, but the old man felt a shift, a quiet connection forged in that fleeting moment. He returned to his seat, reopening his book, but his thoughts lingered on her. On the envelope, the tremor in her hands, the way she'd mentioned Fort Walker. Tomorrow was Veterans Day, and Fort Walker, a military base 30 miles away, would hold its annual memorial. He hadn't been there in decades, not since he'd left the service, but the name stirred memories he'd buried deep. He glanced at her again, wondering what drove her to make that trip, alone and frail, with nothing but an envelope and a question. Over the next hour, he kept an eye on her, discreetly, the way he'd once watched his men in the field. Alert, but unobtrusive. She sipped her coffee slowly, her gaze fixed on the envelope, her fingers tracing its edges as if it held a secret too heavy to share. Occasionally, she'd look out the window, her expression distant, lost in a past only she could see. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror too many times. When she stood to leave, she struggled with her coat, the fabric catching on her thin frame. Without a word, he rose, crossed the diner, and held the door open for her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice stronger now, as if his small kindness had steadied her. "Safe travels," he said simply, tipping his head. She paused, studying him for a moment, as if trying to place him. Then she nodded and stepped into the morning light, her scarf fluttering in the breeze. He watched her go, her slow steps fading down the sidewalk toward the bus stop. The diner felt emptier without her, though he couldn't say why. He returned to his booth, but the book no longer held his attention. Instead, he thought of her envelope, of Fort Walker, of the memorial he'd avoided for 40 years. Maybe it was time to go back, not for himself, but for the men whose names were etched in stone. Men he'd promised to never forget. And maybe, just maybe, he'd see her there, carrying that envelope to wherever it needed to go. The thought settled in him, quiet but firm, like a seed taking root. He didn't know her story, but he knew duty when he saw it, and that was enough to make him care. The next morning, Veterans Day, the air in Redstone carried the sharp bite of November, the kind that made your breath fog and your bones ache. The 75-year-old man with short grey hair rose before dawn, as he always did, his modest home filled with the scent of brewing coffee and the faint creak of old floorboards. He dressed in his usual attire, faded brown jacket, pressed khaki pants, blue button-up shirt, all worn but pristine, a testament to a life of discipline. His hands, rough as sandpaper, paused over a small wooden box on his dresser, where he kept a single item, a military ID card, its edges softened like an old love letter. He hadn't touched it in years, but today he slipped it into his pocket, along with a folded piece of paper bearing names he'd never stopped carrying. The memorial at Fort Walker was calling, and so was the memory of the frail woman from the diner, her tattered envelope and hesitant voice lingering in his mind. He stepped outside, the sky still bruised with pre-dawn purple, and began the walk to the bus stop, his polished shoes clicking against the frost-kissed pavement. The town was quiet, save for the distant hum of a milk truck and the rustle of leaves skittering across the street. At the bus stop, he found her, the white-haired woman, 80 years old, in her threadbare grey coat and faded green scarf. She stood alone, clutching that same envelope, her pale blue eyes scanning the horizon for a bus that wouldn't come for another hour. Her face brightened when she saw him, a flicker of recognition easing her nervous posture. "You're up early," he said, his voice low but warm, like a fire on a cold night. She nodded, her fingers tightening around the envelope. "Couldn't sleep. Got to get to Fort Walker. For someone who can't." Her words were cryptic, but he didn't press. He'd learned long ago that some stories only come when they're ready. Instead, he gestured to the bench. "Mind if I join you?" She hesitated, then nodded, and they sat in companionable silence, the cold metal bench biting through their clothes. The air smelled of damp earth and diesel, the town slowly waking around them. He noticed her shivering, her thin coat no match for the morning chill. Without a word, he shrugged off his brown jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "Oh no, I'm fine," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Keep it for now," he said simply. "I've got plenty of warmth left." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she smiled. A small, fragile thing, like a crack in a dam holding back years of sorrow. They sat there, two strangers bound by a shared sense of duty, watching the sun climb over the desert hills. When the bus finally arrived, its brakes squealing, he helped her aboard, steadying her frail arm as she climbed the steps. They rode in silence, the envelope resting in her lap, its edges worn as if she'd held it for decades. He didn't ask about it, but he wondered who she was honoring, what debt she carried, and why it had brought her here to a place that held his own ghosts. At Fort Walker, the memorial site was a quiet expanse of stone and grass, framed by desert mountains that glowed red under the rising sun. The annual Veterans Day service hadn't yet begun, but a few early arrivals, soldiers, retirees, families, milled about, their voices hushed in reverence. The man and the woman stepped off the bus, the dry air carrying the scent of sage and polished granite. She clutched his jacket, still draped over her shoulders, and he didn't ask for it back. They walked toward the memorial wall, her steps slow but determined, his steady beside her. At the wall, she paused, her eyes scanning the names etched in stone. Each one a story, a life, a loss. Her fingers trembled as she traced one name, her lips moving silently, as if whispering a prayer. He stood a respectful distance away, giving her space, his own gaze fixed on a different section of the wall, where names he knew too well stared back. "You served, didn't you?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. He nodded, his throat tight. "A long time ago." She studied him, her pale eyes sharp despite her age. "You don't talk about it. Most who did, don't." He gave a small shrug, his hands in his pockets. "Words don't change what happened." She nodded, as if she understood more than he'd said, and returned to the wall, her envelope now open in her hands. Inside was a photograph, faded but clear. A young man in uniform, smiling, his eyes full of hope. She didn't explain, and he didn't ask, but he stayed close, a silent sentinel as she placed the photo at the base of the wall, weighting it with a small stone. The act was simple, but it carried the weight of decades, and he felt it in his bones. As they left the memorial, she handed him back his jacket, her hands steadier now. "Thank you," she said, and it wasn't just for the jacket. He nodded, feeling the connection deepen, a bond forged not in words but in shared silence, in the mutual recognition of carrying burdens no one else could see. Back in Redstone, word of the old vet's kindness spread like wildfire through the town's gossip mill. At the diner, the waitress, wiping down tables, recounted how he'd paid for the stranger's coffee and given her his jacket. "Man's got a heart bigger than his wallet," she said to a group of regulars, her voice tinged with admiration. Some nodded, touched by the story. "He's always been good like that," said a retired mechanic sipping his coffee. "Fixed my gate last summer, didn't even ask for a dime." But not everyone was impressed. At the barber shop, a younger man in his 30s with a buzz cut and a chip on his shoulder scoffed. "Old guy's just fishing for attention," he said, flipping through a magazine. "Bet he's not even a real vet. Probably just likes the sympathy." The barber, a man in his 60s who'd served in the Gulf, frowned but said nothing, his scissors snipping rhythmically. Across town, at the community center, a group of women knitting blankets for charity whispered their own doubts. "He's too quiet," one said, her needles clicking. "Never talks about his service. If he was really somebody, we'd know." Their words weren't malicious, just skeptical, the kind of judgment small towns breed when someone doesn't fit the mold. The old man heard none of this, but he felt the eyes on him as he walked home that evening, the weight of their stares heavier than usual. He'd always been a private man, but privacy came at a cost. Misunderstanding, assumption, the slow erosion of trust. The worst came from someone he'd once called a friend, Tom, a retired postman who'd shared coffee with him for years. At the diner, Tom leaned toward a neighbor, his voice low but sharp. "He's got no family, no medals, no nothing. If he was a hero, where's the proof? Sounds like a tall tale to me." The betrayal stung, though the old man didn't know it yet. He'd trusted Tom, shared quiet mornings over coffee, but trust, he'd learned, was a fragile thing, easily broken by doubt. The community's mixed reactions painted a picture of a town divided, not by malice, but by the human tendency to question what they couldn't see. The old man, unaware of the whispers, kept to his routine, tending his garden, fixing a neighbor's porch step, his kindness unwavering despite the growing skepticism. The test came a few days later at the town's Veterans Day potluck, held in the community center's drafty hall. The room smelled of casseroles and apple pie, the tables lined with paper plates and plastic forks. The old man arrived, carrying a modest tray of cornbread he'd baked himself, his brown jacket swapped for a clean but equally worn sweater. He'd come to honor the day, not to stand out, but eyes followed him as he set his dish on the table. The organizer, a woman in her 50s with a clipboard and a tight smile, approached him. "We're collecting stories for the veteran tribute," she said, her tone polite but pointed. "Everyone's sharing their service history, will you?" The room quieted, heads turning. He felt the weight of their expectations, their doubts, their curiosity. His hand brushed the ID card in his pocket, the names on his folded paper burning against his chest. "I'm just here to eat," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. The organizer's smile faltered. "Well, we'd love to hear from you. It's important to verify who's being honored." The word verify hung in the air, sharp as a blade. He saw the skepticism in her eyes, the same doubt he'd sensed in Tom's voice, in the barbershop whispers. It was a challenge, subtle but real, questioning his place among the veterans gathered. He could have pulled out the ID, told them of jungles and rescues, of men he'd saved and lost, but he didn't. Honor, to him, wasn't in proving himself. It was in keeping promises, even when no one understood. "I'll pass," he said, his tone final, and moved to a corner table, ignoring the murmurs that followed. A younger veteran, a man in his 30s with a purple heart pinned to his chest, leaned toward his friend. "If he won't talk, maybe he's got something to hide," he said, loud enough to carry. The old man heard, but didn't react, his jaw tightening as he cut a piece of cornbread. The moment passed, the potluck resuming, but the sting lingered. He'd sacrificed his pride, his chance to be seen, to protect a truth too heavy for this room. His resolve held, but the cost was a deeper loneliness, a sense that even here, among those who should understand, he was an outsider. The conflict escalated in the days that followed as whispers turned to open criticism. At the diner, a group of regulars debated his actions, their voices carrying across the counter. "He thinks he's above us," one said, a retired teacher with a knack for gossip. "Won't even share his story. What kind of veteran hides like that?" Tom, the postman, chimed in, his betrayal cutting deeper. "I've known him 20 years, and he's never mentioned a single mission. Probably just a clerk who thinks he's a hero." The word spread, twisting like smoke through Redstone streets. At the hardware store, the owner, a man who'd never served, refused the old man's offer to fix a broken shelf. "Don't need charity from someone playing the vet card," he said, his tone cold. The rejection was a slap, but the old man nodded, his face unreadable, and left without a word. The community's judgment grew heavier, a chorus of doubt that drowned out the few who defended him. The waitress, loyal but powerless, snapped at Tom one morning. "You don't know him. He's done more for this town than you ever will." But her words were a whisper against the tide. The old man felt the shift, the way eyes avoided his, the way conversation stopped when he entered a room. He kept going, tending his garden, helping a neighbor carry groceries, but each act felt heavier, like pushing against a current. At night, alone in his small house, he sat by the window, the silence pressing in. Doubt crept into his thoughts, not of his service, but of his choice to stay silent. Had he been wrong to hide? Was his honor worth this isolation? His fingers brushed the ID card, still in his pocket, and he wondered if the woman from the bus, with her envelope and her quiet grief, had faced this too. He hadn't seen her since Fort Walker, but her memory anchored him, a reminder that some debts were worth paying, even when the world turned away. The conflict wasn't over. It was growing, and he knew the worst was yet to come. The days after the Veterans Day potluck grew colder in Redstone, Arizona, not just in the November air, but in the way the town turned its back on the 75-year-old man with short grey hair. His small house, once a haven of routine, felt like a fortress under siege. The silence inside louder than the whispers outside. He woke each morning to the same ritual. Coffee brewed in a dented pot, the scent grounding him as he dressed in his faded brown jacket, pressed khaki pants, and blue button-up shirt. But the spark in his eyes, that stubborn kindness, flickered under the weight of doubt. Not in his past, but in whether his silence, his refusal to prove himself, had cost him the only community he'd known. He stepped onto his porch, the air sharp with the smell of frost and wood smoke, and noticed a neighbor's mailbox hanging crooked. Instinctively, he grabbed his toolbox, the metal handle cold against his rough hands, and fixed it before the sun rose. No one saw, and he didn't expect them to. But as he walked to the diner, his polished shoes crunching on gravel, he felt the town's eyes on him, not with warmth, but with suspicion, as if his every act of kindness was a lie to unravel. The memory of the frail woman from the bus, with her white hair and tattered envelope, haunted him. She'd been at Fort Walker, placing that photograph at the memorial wall, and he'd felt a kinship in her quiet duty. He'd hoped to see her again, to learn her story, but she hadn't returned to the diner or the bus stop. Her absence gnawed at him, a loose thread in a tapestry already fraying. He pushed open the diner's door, the bell jingling, and sat in his usual booth, the vinyl seat creaking under his lean frame. The waitress, her face lined with loyalty, poured his coffee without a word, but her eyes held a warning. The town was talking, and it wasn't kind. He opened his worn Hemingway book, but the words blurred, his thoughts spiraling to the names on the memorial wall, to promises he'd kept for 40 years, to the ID card in his pocket that no one would believe. And then it hit him, a moment where the weight of it all, the doubt, the betrayal, the loneliness, became too much. His hands trembled around the mug, coffee sloshing slightly, and his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Why?" he whispered to himself, the word barely audible, a raw plea to no one. Why keep silent when it cost him everything? Why honor men long gone when the living turned away? His chest tightened, and for the first time in decades, he felt the sting of tears. Not for the past, but for the present. For a world that seemed to punish the quiet valor he'd lived by. He closed his eyes, breathing in the diner's familiar smells, grease, coffee, syrup, anchoring himself against the storm inside. The waitress watched from the counter. Her rag paused, but she didn't approach. She knew some battles were fought alone. That afternoon, he returned home, his steps heavier, and found a note slipped under his door, written in a shaky hand. It was simple, unsigned. "Thank you for the coffee. I won't forget." He knew it was from her, the woman with the green scarf, and his heart lifted for a moment, only to crash when he realized she hadn't left a name, an address, nothing. He walked to the bus stop, hoping to find her, but it was empty, the rusted sign swaying in the wind. He asked the diner's regulars, the post office clerk, even the gas station attendant if they'd seen an 80-year-old woman in a grey coat. No one had. It was as if she'd vanished, leaving only that note and the memory of her trembling hands at the memorial. Her absence cut deeper than he expected, a loss he couldn't name. He'd connected with her, not through words, but through shared silence, through the weight of duties carried alone. Now she was gone, and with her went the one person who'd seemed to understand. He stood at the bus stop, the desert wind biting his face, and felt a hollow ache, not just for her, but for the part of himself he'd given to her, a belief that kindness, however small, mattered. Back home, he placed the note on his kitchen table, next to the wooden box that held his ID card. He didn't open it, but its presence was enough to remind him of what he'd lost. Not just her, but the fragile hope that someone, anyone, might see him for who he was. The town's judgment, the whispers, the betrayal, they'd been bearable when he had that spark of connection. Now, with her gone, he felt adrift, a soldier without a mission, a man without a home. He sat somehow. The weight of it all became too much, and he sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling, the note blurring as tears welled up. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking, a plea to the empty room. Why keep silent when it cost him everything? Why honor promises to men long gone when the living turned away? His chest heaved, and for the first time in decades, a sob broke free, raw and jagged, echoing in the small house. The diner's familiar smells, grease, coffee, syrup, faded from his mind, replaced by the bitter taste of isolation. The town's condemnation grew louder, a chorus of suspicion that drowned out the few who still believed in him. At the grocery store, a clerk, barely 20, smirked as he bagged his tomatoes. "Heard you're some big war hero," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Where's your medal then?" He didn't answer, his face a mask, but her words stung like salt in a wound. At the community centre, a flyer for the next veteran event now included a note. All participants must provide proof of service. It was a direct jab, and he saw it for what it was, a public accusation that he was a fraud. Tom, the retired postman who'd once been his friend, was the loudest voice. At the bar, he held court, his voice booming. I say he's a liar. No stories, no proof, just a sad old man playing the victim. The crowd nodded, some laughing, others looking away, uncomfortable but silent. The betrayal was a knife, twisting deeper because it came from someone he'd trusted. Even the waitress, his staunchest defender, grew quieter, her eyes apologetic as she served his coffee. I know you're good, she whispered once, but her voice was drowned out by a regular's snort. Good at fooling people, maybe. The town had made its verdict. He was a pretender, a nobody hiding behind a fabricated past. Each slight, each sneer chipped away at his resolve, and he began to avoid the diner, the hardware store, anywhere eyes might follow. His world shrank to his garden, his house, the quiet of his own thoughts. But even there, the condemnation followed, a shadow he couldn't escape. One night, unable to sleep, he sat on his porch, the desert sky a blanket of stars. The air smelled of sage and dust, the silence broken only by a distant coyote's howl. His fingers found the wooden box, and he opened it, the military ID card glinting in the moonlight. Next to it, he kept a single dog tag, not his own, but one he'd carried for 40 years, belonging to a man he'd failed to save. He held it, the metal cool and smooth, its etched name a weight heavier than stone. Jimmy, he murmured, the name a prayer, a promise. Memories flooded back. Vietnam, the jungle's suffocating heat, the screams of men pinned down, the mission where he'd led his team through hell to save 28 prisoners, only to lose Jimmy in the final moments. He'd refused a Silver Star, telling his commander the mission was the reward. But now, sitting alone, he wondered if that choice had cursed him, dooming him to a life of invisibility. The dog tag grounded him, its texture a reminder of why he'd stayed silent. Honor wasn't in medals or stories, it was in keeping faith with those who'd trusted him. He thought of the woman with the green scarf, her photograph at the memorial, her note on his table. She'd understood, hadn't she? Her absence ached, but her memory was a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge. He closed the box, his resolve hardening like steel in a forge. He'd carry on, not for Redstone, not for recognition, but for Jimmy, for the names on the wall, for the promises he'd made. The town could judge him, betray him, erase him, but they couldn't take that. He stood, his posture straight as ever, and looked at the stars. A soldier ready for the fight he'd always known would come. The November chill lingered in Redstone, Arizona. But a shift was brewing, subtle as the first light of dawn. The 75-year-old man with short grey hair woke to the familiar scent of coffee, his small house quiet, except for the tick of an old clock. He dressed in his faded brown jacket, pressed khaki pants, and blue button-up shirt. The routine, a lifeline amid the town's condemnation. His hands, rough from years of fixing what was broken, paused over the wooden box on his dresser, where his military ID card and Jimmy's dog tag rested. He didn't open it today, but its weight anchored him, a reminder of promises kept through decades of silence. The frail woman with the green scarf, her tattered envelope, her absence. They haunted him still, but her note, "Thank you for the coffee. I won't forget," sat on his kitchen table, a beacon in the dark. He'd faced the town's betrayal, the sting of Tom's words, the clerk's sneer, the community centre's pointed flyer. His kindness had been tested, his honour questioned, and yet he'd stood firm, driven by a duty no one saw. Today, he stepped outside, the desert air sharp with sage and frost, and walked toward the diner, his polished shoes steady despite the eyes he knew would follow. He didn't expect change, didn't hope for redemption, just to keep going, to honour the names on the memorial wall, to carry the spark of kindness for one more day. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. At the diner, the bell jingled as he entered, and the waitress, her face lined with quiet loyalty, met his gaze with something new. Urgency. "You need to see this," she said, sliding a newspaper across the counter. The headline read, "Forgotten Hero. The Truth About Redstone's Silent Veteran." His heart skipped, his fingers tightening around the paper. The article, written by a journalist from a nearby city, told a story he'd never shared. It spoke of a man who'd led the Cambodia prisoner rescue mission in 1975, saving 28 American POWs without losing a single man. It mentioned a Silver Star refused, a career in Special Forces, operations still redacted in Pentagon files. And it named him not by his choice, but by someone else's. How? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the diner's smells of grease and coffee fading under the weight of the moment. The waitress pointed to a man in a booth, mid-40s, with a laptop and a nervous smile. Reporter got a tip, she said. Said it came from a woman who saw you at Fort Walker. Tracked down your service record through a Pentagon contact. The woman with the green scarf? It had to be her. His mind raced to her trembling hands. The photograph at the memorial, the note she'd left. She'd seen him, not just as the old vet, but as the man he'd been, the man he still was. The revelation hit like a wave, not of pride, but of relief, a crack in the wall of isolation he'd built. The reporter approached, hesitant. Sir, I spoke to a Colonel Wexler at the Pentagon. He said you're a legend. Why didn't you tell anyone? The old man shook his head, his voice steady. It wasn't about me. It was about them, the ones who didn't come back. The reporter nodded, scribbling, but the old man's eyes were on the newspaper, on the truth laid bare for Redstone to see. The catharsis came swiftly, a tide turning in the town's heart. By noon, the diner was packed, not with the usual crowd, but with neighbours, veterans, even the skeptical barber, their faces a mix of shame and awe. The waitress, wiping tears, handed him a letter, its envelope worn but sealed, addressed to him in a shaky hand. It was from her, the woman with the green scarf. Inside, she wrote of her son, a soldier lost in Vietnam whose name was on the Fort Walker wall. She'd seen the old man's kindness, his quiet reverence at the memorial, and recognized a fellow keeper of promises. I told the reporter, she wrote, because the world needs to know men like you still exist. Thank you for reminding me I'm not alone. Her name was Clara, and she'd returned to her sister's home in Tucson, her pilgrimage complete. The old man read the letter twice, his throat tight, the paper trembling in his hands. Clara's words were a mirror, reflecting the honor he'd doubted, the kindness he'd thought wasted. Outside, the town gathered, their murmurs no longer sharp, but soft, apologetic. Tom, the postman who'd betrayed him, approached, his face flushed with guilt. I was wrong, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I'm sorry. The old man met his eyes, his expression unreadable, then nodded once. Learn from it, he said simply, and turned away. The weight of forgiveness too heavy for one moment. The community centre organiser, her clipboard forgotten, announced a new veteran tribute, this time with his name at the top, no proof required. The clerk from the grocery store, her smirk gone, offered a quiet apology, her hands twisting nervously. The town's offenders faced their reckoning, not through punishment, but through the mirror of their own actions, their doubts exposed as small against the man they'd judged. The old man stood in the diner, Clara's letter in his pocket, and felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. Not pride, but peace, the kind that comes when justice, delayed but never absent, arrives. Redstone changed in the weeks that followed, transformed by the ripple of one man's quiet valor. The community centre launched a new tradition, a wall of honour, not just for veterans but for anyone who served others without seeking reward. His name was first etched in simple bronze, but he didn't attend the unveiling, choosing instead to tend his garden, the scent of tomatoes and sunflowers grounding him. The diner became a hub for storytelling, where veterans, young and old, shared their truths, inspired by a man who'd shown that silence could speak louder than boasts. The waitress started a jar labelled Pay It Forward, where customers left coins for strangers' coffees, a nod to the old man's act for Clara. Even Tom, chastened, began volunteering at the VA, his loud voice now used to advocate, not accuse. The town's skepticism softened, replaced by a new awareness. Small acts, unnoticed, could shift the world. The old man noticed the changes. Neighbours' smiles, a wave from the barber. A thank you note slipped under his door. He didn't seek the spotlight, but when a young veteran asked him to speak at the community centre, he agreed, not for himself, but for Jimmy, for Clara's son, for the names on the wall. I don't have much to say, he told the crowd, his voice soft but clear. Just this, honour isn't in what you show. It's in what you do when no one's looking. The room, filled with faces young and old, fell silent, his words sinking deep, a lesson carved in the town's soul. The legacy of his kindness grew, a quiet force that outlived the newspaper headlines. Clara's letter, now framed on his wall, became a touchstone, a reminder that one act, buying a coffee, lending a jacket, could echo across lives. He learned through the reporter that Clara had started a support group in Tucson for families of fallen soldiers, inspired by their shared moment at Fort Walker. Her son's photograph, left at the memorial, was now part of a travelling exhibit honouring the lost, and she'd named it after the old man's unspoken creed. Promises kept. In Redstone, the pay it forward jar grew, funding meals, bus tickets, even a scholarship for a veteran's child. The old man, now a quiet legend, found peace in his routine, his garden, his walks to the diner. He still carried Jimmy's dog tag, still visited Fort Walker each Veterans Day. But now he did so with a lighter heart, knowing his silence had spoken, his kindness had endured. He wasn't alone anymore, not because the town saw him, but because he'd seen himself, through Clara's eyes, through the legacy he'd unwittingly built. His small house, once a fortress, became a home again, filled with the scent of coffee, the rustle of sunflower seeds, the weight of a life well lived. He'd fought no battles for glory, sought no medals, but in the end, he'd won something greater. The trust of a town, the gratitude of a stranger, the certainty that honour once earned never fades. The sun set over Redstone, painting the desert sky in hues of crimson and gold. The old man, 75, stood at his garden gate, his brown jacket catching the last rays of light. His hand rested on the wooden box, now open on his porch table, the ID card and dog tag glinting like stars. He looked out at the town, its lights flickering on, each one a story, a life, a promise. He thought of Clara, of Jimmy, of the names on the wall and smiled. A small, quiet thing, full of peace. His kindness had been his weapon, his silence his shield, and together they'd changed everything. What moment in your life did kindness win against all odds? Write it in the comments, share this story, hit that like button, and subscribe. Stories like these remind us why we keep fighting for what's right.